So I know I'm usually very snarky in my replies to this sort of thing, and don't worry, I will be. But making this video has taught me so much. I thought I knew a lot about forced sterilization and the reasoning behind it. Racism, mostly. But I went down a rabbit hole last night after this person left me this comment, so in addition to being sassy, I'm just really excited to share this information with you guys. So this commenter seems to think that I'm telling some kind of reverse racist lie. I say that white women are often refused sterilization simply because they're white. But as it happens, I did actually have big proof, so let me show it to you. First, we need to talk about the term stratified reproduction, because I saw it used in every single study and article that I came across. Quote, stratified reproduction is a widely used social scientific concept created by Shelley Cullen that describes imbalances in the ability of people of different races, ethnicities, nationalities, classes, and genders to reproduce and nurture their children. The main thing propping up stratified reproduction is racism, and I'm gonna go super in-depth on that in a second. But for now, because of racism, many programs and laws and not so lawful but still unpunished acts were built to keep the population of BIPOC down. Forced sterilization is the biggest example of this, and I have at least one, maybe two videos of that in this playlist. And they go through the history of that all the way up to today. But another system that supports stratified reproduction is the reschooling of Indigenous children, where they were stolen from their parents, kept in boarding schools run by white people, forced to give up their Indigenous language, any clothes they had that weren't deemed white enough. And sometimes these kids who had parents were adopted by white families with the goal of civilizing them. The biggest goal was to have the children raised by white people to either not reproduce at all or reproduce with a white person. The governments hoped that this would be the beginning of generation by generation completely erasing Indigenous blood. Then you have the prison system. In the US, Black Americans are incarcerated 5 times more often than white Americans. And Latinx Americans are 1.3 times more likely to be jailed than whites. Now, your Trumper uncle will say at Thanksgiving this year that that's because BIPOC just commit more crimes. But that's not true. According to the FBI, in 2019, 69.9% of all adults arrested were white, 26.1% were black, and 4% were other races. And that's not to say that the prison population is made up of more blacks than whites. That's actually not true. And of course, the sentence can depend on the crime, but let's keep in mind that there are black people in prison who have been there for years, maybe even decades, simply for having marijuana on them. Meanwhile, we have rapists who walk free simply because they can catch a ball real good. Remember when Shanisha Taylor got arrested for leaving her 2 kids in a car while she went to a job interview? Thankfully, she only got 18 years of probation for her crime, and her kids were unharmed. And yet, when Justin Ross Harris, a white man, left his toddler in his car for hours and the kid died, Justin was acquitted of murder. And even if a black woman is in prison for a shorter period than a white woman, the chances of the black woman being forcibly sterilized are much higher than that of a white woman, possibly 100% higher. Because while historically poor white women were kind of put in the same class as BIPOC, these days, they don't seem to make those classifications. If you're white, you're white. And because of that change, this leaves the door open for white women to push out more progeny, while black women just do not have the physical ability anymore. But how did we get here? Why does the government and medical personnel see it as a goal to have as many white babies as possible produced? And why do they want to prevent so many BIPOC babies from being born? Again, racism, obviously, but let's go into more detail. It's not revolutionary to say that black people have been treated poorly from day one of American history. Honestly, even before that, when it was still British history. And I do want to underline that in this video, I'm only speaking of American history and American reproductive history. When black people were enslaved, it was part of the job of the black women to produce more slaves, whether it be with another slave or with the slave owner. So because black women were forced to be pregnant so much, gained the reputation of being hypersexual and hyperfertile. And these stereotypes went on and continue on. After the civil rights movement, the government, freaking out, created the idea of the welfare queen. I'm sure you've heard of the welfare queen. Characterized as a woman, almost always black, who collects government assistance through fraud and child exploitation. And because the hypersexual stereotype was around, it was said that these black welfare queens popped out kid after kid as much as they could to collect that sweet, sweet government money. However, in the last decade or so, it's been proven that the welfare queen was just a shitty myth. pushed by Ronald Reagan during his presidential bid, and further handicapping Black women. 1 step forward, 15 steps back. But how does this relate to the current sterilization process? I'm so glad you asked. From this study, throughout U.S. history, the fertility and childbearing of poor women and women of color were not valued equally to those of affluent white women. The ideology of stratified reproduction persists today in social welfare programs, drug policy, and programs promoting long-acting reversible contraception. At their core, sterilization abuses reflected an ideology of stratified reproduction in which some women's fertility was devalued compared to other women's fertility. Now, remember how Black women were stereotyped as hypersexual and hyperfertile? Despite it being the 21st century, this stereotype persists, and it has and will cause an OBGYN to look at a Black woman asking for birth control and see the woman as too sex crazed to responsibly take the pill or replace her NuvaRing. OBGYNs are twice as likely to recommend sterilization to Black women and other women of color who are pursuing birth control than a white woman. Because you see, white women have self-control. The doctors trust that a white woman can set an alarm on her phone to take her pill. A white woman knows how to go to CVS and pick up more condoms. And besides, white women don't even want to have sex. America has always broadcast its fear that the white race is disappearing. Not only does the government actively encourage white people to have more babies, but many American schools teach a sex ed curriculum that makes it hard to know how to not get pregnant, and they made laws to prevent us from accessing abortion. They also added strict rules to keep us from getting sterilized. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that BIPOC women are lucky to be sterilized so easily. The overarching issue is that people with uteruses in America are not trusted to make decisions about that uterus. This study shows that BIPOC women are often sterilized despite wanting to have more children, whereas white women are refused sterilization even if that sterilization will save her life because, well, you might want more kids. I mentioned in a video a few weeks ago that my mom wanted to get a hysterectomy so that she wouldn't have a period anymore. The doctors didn't relent until she was 55, still only allowed her to have an ablation, and asked the 55-year-old woman if she was sure she was done having kids. Meanwhile, a 25-year-old Black woman might be forced to have a sterilization despite wanting more kids. Now let's take a look at a chart from this study. So the healthcare provider, when presented with two women who are exactly the same in every way, education, number of children, health status, socioeconomic status, if they are both seeking sterilization, the BIPOC woman is much more likely to be sterilized than the white woman due to those stereotypes that we talked about. But I've mentioned a few times before in this video that there is forced sterilization of BIPOC women, and we need to talk about it. Again, I have a full video on this with sources in this playlist, but I can't just skip over it in this conversation. So this info is from the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology and talks about how serious a problem forced sterilization of BIPOC women is when they are incarcerated or, in the last decade or so, held at the border. As I discussed earlier, Black women are more likely to be incarcerated and more likely to be sterilized while incarcerated. And many women at the border today are also forcibly sterilized. The worst part about the latter is that for the women who don't speak English, they often have no idea what is going to happen or what happened. Because of course, no one's going to give them the courtesy of giving them medical papers in the language they speak. It's silly, medical papers only come in English. The ACOG says of these settings, special procedural safeguards and oversight are needed when incarcerated women are sterilized because of the likelihood that the coercive environment of prison impedes true informed consent. They add, sterilization is a route to reproductive autonomy for women. At the same time, sterilization can also result in reproductive injustice, as it did historically in the US, and that studies suggest that patient race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status affect physician attitudes and practices around reversible and permanent contraception. And what's both comforting and terrifying about this appearing on ACOG's site, the organization that oversees how all American OBGYNs practice, is that it's there because it needs to be. I'm comforted by the fact that they are acknowledging this and speaking out about how wrong it is. The fact that some doctors need to be guided through still present racism is disappointing. It would be disappointing if any medical personnel, be it a family doctor, a therapist, a podiatrist, had to be walked through this. But in the case of OBGYNs, these doctors control, sometimes with their own scalpel, whether or not you can have children or more children. As I've said, I have read and heard of so many uterus havers being denied sterilization despite a family history or the current presence in their body of cancer within the reproductive system. There are OBGYNs in this country who would rather have a white woman squeak out just one more child before she dies of ovarian cancer than perform an oophorectomy so that that woman can spend the rest of her long life with her children who already exist. You commenters seem to think that I was just making up these stories to martyr myself, but this happens. You mentioned that there's a list of 1,500 plus doctors who will willingly sterilize you, no questions asked. And you're absolutely right. Dr. Fran has her own list, and there is also a list on the child-free subreddit, which is where I found my doctor who did my sterilization. I also wanted to point out that this list is international. I think a lot of people are under the impression that it's only for America or North America. But the international list is a great example of why these lists aren't the solution. They are a stepping stone towards the solution. If you are a South Korean person looking to be sterilized, you have one choice. And while I'm sure Dr. Chung is great, if the person who wants to be sterilized lives 4 hours away from his office, most likely what they'll do first is ask their current OBGYN if they would be willing to sterilize them. Because it can't hurt to ask, right? And I don't know what South Korean healthcare is like, but when I was pursuing this in New York, just as an example, I paid $400 out of pocket to be told that at 30 years old, I wasn't old enough to know that I didn't want kids. That was my second rejection. After that, I went to the list. But I'm very fortunate to live in New York City, where there are tons of options, and if none of them in the city worked, I could have gone outside of the city because I had access to a car. But most locations out of large cities, including in America, don't offer that many options. And of course, many people who want to be sterilized are willing to travel by car, by plane, to be sterilized. But you have to consider how much this is going to cost. If you're going out of town or out of state, you'll probably have to get a hotel room for at least one night. If you have a car, you'll have to pay for gas. You may have to rent a car or take public transportation. Then you need time off work, which some people can't afford. There's so much more to being sterilized than just consulting a list and finding a doctor. It's also important to note that doctors are human and their opinions are subject to change. For example, this New York doctor is noted to be less comfortable sterilizing people under 30. This Redditor also found out that all the doctors in her area that were on the list no longer were willing to sterilize people. People tried to keep this list as up to date as possible, but the mind of a doctor could change tomorrow. And the list makers might not know that it's changed until another Redditor calls that doctor or pays $400 to see them in person, only to be told no. How many times would you be willing to pay $400 to be told that even though you are firmly in adulthood, you're just not mature enough to know whether or not you want kids, despite the doctor who just turned you down congratulating a 16-year-old on her pregnancy? So I hope this video was helpful. I'm sure the commenter who asked for this video didn't even make it halfway through. But if you did, thank you. I hope you learned something. I'm certainly open to learning more, so feel free to leave comments and sources down below. Don't forget to check out the History of Sterilization playlist. And now I present a screen listing all of my sources for this video. I hope it is the big proof that the commenter was asking for. Thanks for listening.